In Rise of Kingdoms, there are so many legendary commanders, and I'm sure that most of you guys watching have invested in some legendary commanders that are just not in the meta anymore, and maybe you don't even use them anymore. So today, I'll be talking about how Lilith can maybe fix this issue, and I will discuss what you can do to get the most value out of these possibly outdated commanders. So if you want to get the most value from your older commanders or want to know some ideas that Lilith should add to the game, you definitely want to check out the rest of the video. Now let's begin by discussing ways currently in the game for you to earn some more value for your older commanders. And quick spoiler alert, there really aren't that many, and the ones currently in the game have their own downsides. First of all, we have the museum, and this is probably the best way in the game to boost some of your older commanders. For example, you can make a commander like Julius Caesar, someone who was so far out of the meta, usable again, like 20% all damage, 20% march speed, really strong boost. You can make a commander like Mehmed, super far out of the meta, very good. You can make a commander like Minamoto, someone who was already decent, absolutely amazing. So the museum, really nice for making these extremely old commanders fairly good again. And when it was first released, it was really free to play due to the fact that you could access relic coins and also you could access exhibit coins extremely easily. But nowadays, it is extremely difficult to actually get relic coins. Exhibit coins are still fairly easy, but relic coins are super hard to come by. Also, another issue with the museum is there aren't really many commander releases in here. Like a year ago, Lilith mentioned adding KVK2 commanders, and we've only gotten 4 of the 6. Like, Tamaris and Edward have just not been added at all, and I don't know when they're going to come and I don't know what they're going to do. So we don't know when more commanders will come to this. We don't know if they're going to even add more commanders to the museum. The latest one they added was like Pyrus, and it's only because he was a gold key commander. So we really do not know when to expect some more commanders to come to the museum, if there will be any more, which is why this is definitely flawed. It's become a little bit more pay to win with these relic coins, plus they're not adding any more commanders in here, which is definitely making it very difficult to make older commanders better if you aren't adding any extras. The next form of getting value from older commanders comes from a specific KVK method, and that is the Siege of Orleans KVK. In this KVK format, you can access an auxiliary skill which allows you to actually take a skill from one of your older commanders which you're not running anymore and put it onto a newer commander of your choice. For example, I can take a skill off Gilgamesh. Let's say I want to take Gilgamesh's second skill and I can put it on any commander of my choice. I could put it on Henry, I could put it on Boudica, I could put it on YSG, LIANG, Cyrus, and it actually allows me to get value from older commanders which I'm not running on the field, and allows me to take a part of their kit which I maybe really like and put on commanders which are A, actually usable on the field, or B, I really like how they work on the field. So it gives these older or not as strong commanders a lot more value. But this also has its own problems in the fact that you need 3 auxiliary skills per march that you're running, and it's all fine. Everyone loves it when you're using 1 or even 2 auxiliary skills per march. But when it comes to the point where you want to actually bench some commanders which you'd be using anyways, like I would use Nebula in the open field, but if I were in this KVK, I'd have to bench him so I could use his auxiliary skill on my Boudica. Then it comes to the point where it's like no one actually wants to do this. It's like I have all these commanders that I want to use on the open field normally, but I can't because I have to put them as auxiliary skill commanders. So it is really annoying once you get later into the KVK and it becomes like to the point if you don't have 10 max commanders, you're not going to be able to get anywhere because you won't be able to benefit from the auxiliary skills. And if you have got 1 less skill on a march compared to another player, you're going to get absolutely wrecked. So there is definitely a few issues behind Siege of Orleans KVK, especially in the fact that the later you get, the more auxiliary skills you need, to the point where it becomes fairly unreasonable for lower spenders and free-to-play players. So that is the main issue with auxiliary skills. But when it's 1 or 2 skills, it is actually really nice, and I know there was a lot of positive feedback about it. The next and final method of gaining value from your older commanders is through the Heroic Anthem KVK, and the way you get value in this KVK from older commanders is through Bastion quests. And the way that this works is you can do a Bastion quest, just normal Bastions. Pretty much every KVK has Bastions, and in that Bastion, if you reach Favor level 6, you can use a commander's skill as a support skill. The one thing to note here though is you don't get to choose the commander and you don't get to choose which skill it is. So this is really dependent on A, either getting extremely lucky and getting a commander which you have. Like I don't own Ramsey's second skill, so I'm not going to be able to get much value from this. But a player who did own Ramsey's second skill will be able to access this value free to play, and you only need 2 support skills per march. The only downside, like I said before though, is you don't get to choose which commanders are in the Bastions, and you do not get to choose which skill of theirs is actually in the Bastion. So it is a little bit upsetting in the fact that you don't get as much flexibility as you would in the Siege of Orleans KVK, but this still does give some of your older commanders a little bit more value, and it's not as well oriented as the Siege of Orleans auxiliary skills. Now that I've discussed ways currently you can get value for your commanders, I'm sure you noticed there's really not that many ways. Like, if you look at it, there's probably 3 main ways I mentioned there, and they are like the current only ways to get real value from your older commanders. So what should Lilith do? What should they add to the game? And I'm going to just chuck out a few ideas here. Obviously, museum relics are really, really strong. So what I'd like to see is more museum relics. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. They've been taking their time with releasing these. Like, I would have expected a year ago Edward and Tamaris to have their relic by now, because Alexander the Great didn't need a relic nearly as much as Edward and Tamaris did, yet they still haven't been added to the game. And I don't necessarily want the commanders to be in generational order. For example, they added all the KVK 1 and Gold Key commanders, and then they started adding every other commander in their release order. So Genghis Khan and Saladin released, and then the infantry commanders Constantine and Alexander the Great released, and then you would have Edward and Tamaris releasing. What I think Lilith should do with the relics is just pick and choose the commanders that need them, because there are definitely a ton of commanders in the game right now who are, if they got a relic, I'd say might be a fairly decent commander. For example, Ramses with a relic could be really interesting, but in theory, we'd have to wait for Guan Yu, we'd have to wait for Attila, Edward and Tamaris, before Ramses even gets looked at getting a relic, so you're gonna have to wait for a while before these commanders get relics, but they definitely need them. So I would really, really like if Lilith started adding relics as a thing that just comes as a commander gets older. I know Lilith knows what the meta is, they're not stupid, so they can definitely add relics by judging the meta and seeing how many people are using Ramses. He's definitely not in the meta right now, we should add a relic. Leonidas, no one's really using him, maybe we should throw a relic on him. Not many people are running Moctezuma. I know this is stupid, he's a rubbish commander, but maybe he should get a relic. Or not many people are using CJ, maybe we should give him a nice little boost, because that a lot of players would definitely appreciate. Lilith kind of picking and choosing which commanders to give a small buff. And I'm not saying make these commanders literally the meta. Obviously, Lilith is still a business at the end of the day. They do have to make money, but making it so that these commanders are somewhat usable in the field and people who invested in them aren't absolutely screwed over, I'm going to tell you would go a long way, and a lot of players would really appreciate it, rather than just releasing them in chronological order. This commander, then this commander, then this commander, and you can just predict the order if they're even going to release any more, because at this point, it doesn't even look like they're going to release Edward and Tamaris. The next thing Lilith can add to actually give more value to older commanders is, oddly enough, adding them to the Legendary Tavern. There are a ton of older commanders which just should be in the Legendary chest that are not there, because A, they're not in the Orotok Tavern, and B, they're not really going to be used on the Wheel of Fortune or Mightiest Governor, because there's just better options out there. So why not add them to Legendary Tavern? My favorite one to fall back on this is Gilgamesh. He is really not that amazing on the open field. I mean, he's decent, and he's okay. You can only get him in Wheel of Fortune, though, and there's nowhere else to get him, so no one's even going to look at Gilgamesh. Someone who might have a 5-2-1-1 Gilgamesh like myself, I personally would run him on the field if I could access his gold heads a little bit easier. Like, I don't want to spend my gems on Wheel of Fortune on him. I would love using the Legendary chest. I'd probably actually use him somewhat in my murder ball in some specific situations, and that's not just me saying it for the video. I honestly would run him, but there's no way for me to really unlock him in a good situation, and I don't really want to pump generic sculptures in him, and I don't really want to use gems on him, but I'd be happy to choose him out of Legendary chests. So adding some of these older commanders which aren't really meta anymore into the Legendary chest would allow players who A, want to use these commanders, maybe they have a specific account like mine, or B, they're somewhat through investing in these commanders, to either finish their investment or to allow them to consider actually using the commander, which could bring them a little bit more open field value, because they can't get open field value if they're not even invested in. So giving some of these older commanders some access in the Legendary Tavern would definitely be nice. And the same can be said with the daily special offer. Obviously, Lilith is adding more and more to this. We've been seeing them add more and more commanders here, but I think they're going to stop at around the Trajan and Moctezuma. I think the final commanders they would add if they go off the Legendary Tavern is Zhang Yu. So not too sure if they're going to keep on adding commanders in the daily special offer. We haven't seen one for a little while, but daily special offer and legendary taverns are definitely a nice way to allow more players to access these not as powerful commanders, but still have an option to use them in a more free-to-play manner without having to spend gems and definitely spending way less generic sculptures, so they can still somewhat focus on the meta. It can also allow these commanders to be used with other meta commanders. For example, Gilgamesh actually works decently with Boudica, and if you first got the Season of Conquest out of that legendary chest, he'd be one of the better options if he was added. Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar would still be stronger, but if someone had Nebuchadnezzar and they wanted a good pair with Boudica, they don't really want to spend gems on unlocking the commander, don't want to spend many gold heads, you could maybe even go for a Gilgamesh out of a legendary chest. I know it's a bit far-fetched, but those are the things where you look at the commander and be like, I can access them quite easily. Maybe if I take him to 5-5-1-1, it wouldn't be too bad. So adding some of these more outdated legendary commanders to the Legendary Tavern will definitely be a very, very nice change, and I've said it before, and I know a lot of players would really like it. The next improvement I could recommend is possibly adding a permanent buff to a commander. I don't mean just like a museum relic, just like, here's a buff you can buy for money or buy for some in-game currency. I mean like a you use this commander a lot, you've earned a buff. For example, maybe something like earn 5 million kills with Gilgamesh and you increase his damage factor by 400. Something like that would be really, really interesting. Or maybe if you increase your bond with that commander, for example, if I keep speaking with Ethelfled, she gets a 20% attack buff. And that definitely wouldn't be game breaking. Like, an Ethelfled with a 20% attack buff would make her a somewhat decent commander. It wouldn't make her like, oh my gosh, Ethelfled's literally just taken the meta by storm. It'd make her more usable. And I know as a fact, if you gave Gilgamesh 400 extra damage factor, he'd be a much more usable commander. So players who did invest in him or are considering investing in him would have the option to if they so wanted. So you'd be able to A, get value out of older commanders which you're possibly running, or B, even consider going and backwards investing in some old commanders, because literally as of right now, nobody ever backwards invests. As someone who used to personally backwards invest, I have Cyrus in my kit. Like, I think that says a lot. I don't even backwards invest anymore, and I'm a pure archer account. I can save for 6 months before new commanders release, but I'm choosing not to backwards invest. I would have got Gilgamesh maybe a year ago, but now he's just like gonna get so blown out of the meta, it's ridiculous. So giving these commanders some amount of extra skill damage, some amount of extra stats, for either possibly using him to fight other players, using him in specific game modes. Like, for example, using Gilgamesh in 20 games of Olympia and getting a win in those 20 games and giving him 400 damage factor would be amazing. Even if it's not open field only, maybe if you make it just for a specific game mode, like use Gilgamesh in Soroli Crisis, you get an extra 1000 damage factor in Soroli Crisis. At least it'd be a nice, unique way to get some value out of that commander, or at least be able to use him, because I'm sure some people look at commanders like, wow, this commander is really cool, but they suck on the field, and that's me with Gilgamesh. I have a bit of a soft spot for him. I think he's got a cool design, but I can't use him. There's just nowhere in the open field for me to even justifiably use Gilgamesh without him just getting annihilated. So even if it's a buff in Canyon or Ark of Osiris or Champions of Olympia, it would be cool to give these commanders some sort of a buff for using them, or some sort of a buff for even just investing in them, and that would be a nice little addition to the game. Obviously, I'd prefer if this was an open field buff, and I'm not saying, once again, make it game breaking. I don't think the commanders need to be the current meta, but they should at least be able to sustain themselves against current meta commanders. Like, maybe Gilgamesh should be able to trade 1 to 1.5, or even 1.5 to 1, where it's not an amazing trade, but I can still justify using him because he has some debuffs, he has some reductions to the commander that's his primary, he's got some health reductions, so I could at least justify running Gilgamesh, whereas right now he'd probably get demolished by a CPO to the point where it's like, why would I even consider investing in him or even running him? And I think that the small little buff to their skills by using that commander more would be very, very nice. The next idea I have is adding an extra skill to a commander. So for example, we've got CJ right here, a very out of the meta commander. Not many people run him on the open field, but I know a fair amount of people may have expertised him when he was released. For example, Chisco literally expertised CJ on his mini account, but I'm sure that he's not running CJ anymore. So what could they do to change this? Well, if you have an expertise CJ, they could add an extra skill, a 5th skill, or technically a 6th skill, that's fairly cheap to level up, maybe 10, 15 gold heads a level, possibly the literal same price as the first skill, and that would give the commander a little bit more value, because we're looking at a commander like CJ, who needs a little bit of a boost. He doesn't need a major boost to be somewhat usable, and if you give him that little boost at the cost of maybe 50, 60 gold heads, I think it'd be fairly reasonable for most players to actually go out of their way and unlock that. For example, myself, if I wanted Gilgamesh and I had him expertise, and I had an option to get a 6th skill, I may consider going out of my way and grabbing that skill. And the thing about this is, it wouldn't make players go out of their way to invest in these older commanders. Rather, it would reward players who have these commanders at a higher level due to investing in them while they were in the meta. Like, if I know a lot of people have Ramsey's expertise, then I can add that 6th skill to him, and a lot of players can go back and put a few extra gold leads into Ramsey's and make him a commander that you can actually consider running in a murder ball, which would be really nice for players who maybe are trying to move up in the meta. Maybe you were running Ramsey's YSG this whole entire time, and you're like, I want to get a Boudica, I don't really want to run YSG, I feel like he's too squishy, and Ramsey's is too weak, but now I have to go get ZHUGE, and that's a massive investment. Well, if they add a 6th skill to Ramsey's, he could actually be a nice filler commander over a ZHUGE that could work with your Boudica. Well, maybe you do still invest in ZHUGE, and while that's going on, you're using the Ramsey's. So you can see right there are very interesting ways that you could implement this 6th skill and make it fairly powerful. Another way you could actually implement this though is through making it not using the commander with generic gold heads, but using them with their actual commander sculptures. And the reason this would be good is, if you add these commanders to the Legendary Tavern, it would actually make them somewhat usable in the Legendary Tavern. It'll be like, alright, I have Ramsey's expertise, if I get more Ramsey sculptures, I can unlock that 6th skill so that he can be a little bit more powerful. And it would once again give another level of effectiveness to the Legendary Tavern. While yes, this event can be a bit pay to win, it is still fairly free to play at the same time, so this would be a very, very unique way of actually implementing these commanders and their 6th skill. You could even add it to the Wheel of Fortune, for example, because if it's the generic sculpture heads, a commander like maybe Saladin who could get a 6th skill would be able to use a Saladin sculpture that you get from the Legendary Tavern or you get from the Wheel of Fortune to give him a little bit more power on the open field, and I'm sure that a lot of players would enjoy this change and it wouldn't be too game breaking. The final idea I have, which might be a little bit more far-fetched, is make auxiliary skills permanent, because we know they work from the auxiliary KVK. A lot of players had fairly positive feedback about it, especially the first lower levels. I know there was some negative feedback about there being too many auxiliary skills later on, but for the first, just when you had one auxiliary skill, a ton of players were fairly happy that they got to get some value out of older commanders which they didn't use anymore. And obviously it was a little bit pay to win in the fact that a lot of whales could access commanders like Artemisia, which a lot of free-to-play players just didn't invest in. But it still gave free-to-play players who had Ramses some value from Ramses, because you could take Ramses' 2nd skill and give an archer 40% more attack, which you literally wouldn't have had before. Or you take Ramses' 3rd skill and give him a skill damage taken reduction, which is insanely good, and also make them have more march speed and stuff like that. So it allowed these commanders to get some value without necessarily being used on the open field and being merged into the meta, so it made these older commanders usable again. And I think that having one auxiliary skill slot on the main commanders that you're running wouldn't be too insane. Do not give it to their secondaries, make it only apply to the primary, and then you can put that auxiliary skill onto the commander. And hopefully it would be a free thing if they added it, like it's just a thing you add to the commander, it's just a free thing you get to do. And I'm sure a lot of players with older commanders would like to have auxiliary skills on their newer commanders to put one skill off an old commander on there, and it could actually make this commander unusable, and I think it would still be fairly reasonable. If I put an auxiliary skill in my Boudica with my Gilgamesh, I can't run Gilgamesh. I think that is still fairly reasonable, because no one's really going to run Gilgamesh. At least my Boudica gets to get some value out of him. Or maybe, let's say, Leonidas. I get to take Leonidas' 2nd skill where he gets defense and rage, and I can put that onto my Scipio. That would be very interesting, and at least my Leonidas, who I know a lot of players have Leonidas from when he was really meta, would get some value out of him, because that 2nd skill, a ton of people have it, and it's like, well, he's sitting in my bench right now. I felt bad about investing in him. It doesn't make me want to invest in current commanders. I'm scared that they're going to fall out of the meta. At least now you can guarantee some value out of that commander pretty much forever, because auxiliary skills will always be something that you could fall back on if the commander does fall out of the meta. Now that I've expressed what I want in Rise of Kingdoms for older commanders, I want to know what you guys want in the game, and I'm sure Lilith wants to know too, because we know that Lilith listens to player feedback sometimes. For example, with the equipment system, they completely scrapped the older system because a ton of players got upset about it. So maybe if we suggest some type of a thing they should add to the game, there is a real good chance they add it, and it could make the game fun. So let me know in the comments down below what you guys think should be added to the game to make older commanders viable and powerful again. And if you also agree with any of my ideas, let me know down below. And if you disagree with any, I'm also happy to hear what you guys think, because this is just some experimental thinking, and I'm sure there's places for criticism. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I respond to every single one, and I just want to say thank you much, and I hope to see you in the next one.